In this video, we'll be quickly reviewing the features of the hominin lineage and then working our way through each of the species that have existed in our lineage over the last 7 million years. Now, the major features of our hominin lineage are bipedalism, encephalization, tool use, and also some aspects of our tooth morphology. So first of all, bipedalism, as you know, means upright walking on 2 feet, and there's a lot of skeletal evidence that shows that our bodies have really been adapted over time to support this bipedal walking. So if we look at our postcrania, the bones below our head, we can see that our pelvis is nice and bowl-shaped to support our internal organs, and in human females to support pregnancy. Our leg bones angle inward, which allow us to do really nice inline walking compared to chimpanzee and other quadruped ape walking, which is, when they walk upright, we call it bent hip, bent knee, and it's sort of this crouched position that isn't very efficient. Our big toes have also been modified over time, and so in apes we see that the big toe serves as basically an extra thumb to allow for the grasping of tree branches for these apes that live at least part of their life in the trees. But in us, our big toe has come back in line with the rest of our foot, which provides a lot of propulsion. So as you're walking, you'll be able to tell that your big toe is the last thing to push off of the ground before you lift your foot and take a new step. In the skull, we can also see some evidence for the shift to bipedalism, and we see that at the foramen magnum, which is the big hole at the base of the skull. A foramen magnum in Latin literally just means big hole, because it's exactly what it is. And this is the part of the skull where our spinal cord inserts into our brain. So in hominins, who are upright walkers, we see the foramen magnum is centrally located right underneath the brain case. In chimpanzees, it's located a little bit further to the back of the skull, and that's because they're not upright walkers, but they're also not completely face down the way that, for example, a dog would be. So if you look at a dog's skull, their foramen magnum sits definitely at the back of their head. So basically from the top of our heads to the bottom of our feet, our bodies have been redesigned to support this upright walking on 2 legs, to the point that we now can't go back to being quadrupedal. It may be that some of our earliest ancestors still spent a little bit of their time quadrupedally, or still lived part of their lives in trees, but today our bodies are so adapted to upright walking that we can't go back to that that quadrupedal or even arboreal sort of lifestyle of our ape ancestors. There are a couple of reasons why we might have first evolved bipedalism in our lineage, and most of the hypotheses about this are related to the assumption that our earliest ancestors evolved during a time of climate change, when East Africa was going through some pretty significant environmental deterioration, and so big areas of forest would have been splintered. And so there would have been clumps of forest here and there, but in between those clumps would have been these broad expanses of grassland like you see in the picture here. This grassland would have made life a little bit more challenging for a quadrupedal ape. And so the movement to stand upright is seen as an adaptation to this grassland living. By standing upright in these tall grasses, it would have allowed our ancestors to look over the grass to make sure that they avoid predators. Our earliest hominin ancestors were very small still in stature, didn't have use of sophisticated tools, and they definitely would have made very tasty snacks for lions and saber-toothed cats. So being able to see where the predators are would have been very important for our ancestors. It also would have allowed them to see where new food resources are. So being able to stand upright and constantly be vigilant about your surroundings was probably very important. The second reason why we might have shifted to an upright position is because of thermoregulation, which is basically just controlling our body temperature. The theory behind this is that if our ancestors had remained quadrupedal and walking on all fours in this open grassland environment, they would have exposed their bodies to a much more significant amount of UV radiation. Basically, the sun would be hitting them all across the length of their back. But if you stand upright, then the sun only hits you directly on the top of your head. So this may have been a way of keeping our bodies cool in a very, very hot environment. The final theory that sort of adds to our understanding of bipedalism is that in these open landscapes where hominins were probably traveling from patches of trees to patches of trees, if there had been anything that our ancestors wanted to carry from place to place, it's very difficult to do this as a quadrupedal walker. You essentially would have to hold something in the palm of your hand and then walk on the back of your wrist, which is what chimpanzees do today when they carry objects place to place and walk quadrupedally. It can be done, but it's very, very uncomfortable. And certainly if our ancestors were walking around in these environments for long periods of time, walking on the back of one's hands would not have been very comfortable or very efficient. So standing upright allows a more convenient way to carry things from place to place, carry tools, carry food items, carry babies perhaps, and it would have made it much easier to travel these long distances. Now, early in anthropology, there was the assumption that this movement to an upright posture happened around the same time that our brains really started to expand, this encephalization process. What we know now is that bipedalism actually preceded encephalization by several million years. So it wasn't that we got big brains and then we started walking upright all at once. Instead, our ancestors started walking upright more and more habitually, and then further down the road, we see this big expansion in brain size. So encephalization is that expansion of the brain, and we can see if we look at this little timeline here, some of these earlier species, going back about 4 million years ago, the Australopithecines had relatively small brains, hanging out right here in the 400–500 range of cranial capacity, which is not very large. It's about the size of chimpanzee and gorilla brains today. Compare that to us, Homo sapiens. We're up in the 1,400 cubic centimeters today. So we've got one of the largest brains of all of the hominins that have lived over the last 7 million years, although we actually are beat out by the Neanderthals, a European cousin of ours who topped the scales at 1,400 or 1,500 cubic centimeters. So, you know, we have nice, fantastic big egg heads, but someone else had an even egg-headier head than we did. Tools are also a really important part of our prehistory, and we don't have evidence for the regular use of tools from our earliest ancestors around 7 million years ago, but we do see very significant evidence for early stone tool use around 2.6 million years ago. And this has been the story for the last several years. Some early stone tools were found in Ethiopia dating to 2.6. Just this year, about 6 months ago, some new finds were published, suggesting that our ancestors were actually making and using stone tools by 3.4 million years ago, which is a pretty cool addition to our story. It means it pushes back our tool making and our tool using almost 1 million years more further into the past, which is pretty significant in terms of understanding our ability to, think complexly, our ability to manipulate our environment, our ability to act in cultural ways. Now, as time goes on, our tools get more and more complex, and this probably has to do with the fact that our brains were getting bigger, we were having more complex thoughts, and so we were able to do more complex tasks. And then certainly, as population sizes grow, people share ideas and mingle these technological ideas, and so we get, around 40,000 years ago, some really beautiful pieces of technology from Europe, personal ornaments, elements of art, and then into the modern day. A computer is obviously something that people build, people conceptualize together. And so it's this ability to share knowledge of tools that leads to further and further complexity. Now, our teeth. Every animal, for the most part, has teeth. So just the fact that we have teeth isn't necessarily important, but there are trends in the tooth shape and tooth size of our ancestors that are going to be important for understanding hominin evolution over the last 7 million years. What we can see is that in the early parts of our hominin lineage, our ancestors' teeth were fairly sizable, and there are some groups that have super, super big teeth. This is interpreted as a response to the environment and to the foods that were available to our ancestors. Teeth are really wonderful indicators of the foods an animal eats. So cows and dogs have very different teeth shapes because they're eating very different foods. So we can use teeth to tell us about what our ancestors ate. And we can also use that to tell us about what the environment looked like. Obviously, if we have an animal that is well adapted to eat grass all day long, then they must have been living in an environment where there was a lot of grass around. So there's a lot of information that we can extract from just the shape and the size of the teeth of our ancestors. So we see these big teeth at the beginning of our lineage, but then as we get into the range of 2 million years ago, we see a big reduction in the size of our ancestors' teeth. And this is likely because of a shift to eating more high-quality foods, and specifically meat. Meat is something that, if you can get regular access to it, that's a really great source of protein, a really great source of energy. And certainly eating a pound of meat is going to get you further than eating a pound of grass seeds. So our teeth became smaller because we no longer needed to expend as much energy in processing these really tough savanna foods. Meat would have also supported this big brain growth that we see around that time, 2 million years ago. So our teeth, our brain size, all of this sort of comes together to explain these larger trends that we see in what our ancestors were doing at certain points in our prehistory. So now we're going to kick into each of the individual species. And as we go through each of these species, I want to add them to this timeline of hominin evolution. So you can see on the left side of the screen here, we have a timeline starting with the oldest period down at the bottom, 7 million years ago, and then working our way up to 1 million years ago, and then the present day. So as we add species, we'll be adding from the bottom going up. And then you can also see that this timeline is divided geographically. We have Africa on the left, Europe, and Asia on the right. So with every new species, we'll be plopping it into this timeline to see how our lineage has sort of fleshed out through time. Our starting point then is Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is a fossil that was found in sort of northern Central Africa in Chad. It dates to about 7 or 6 million years ago. And although our fossils are relatively limited of this species, it may represent the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, meaning that about 7 million years ago, this guy and the rest of his species were running around East Africa and Central Africa, and then probably as the climate started to change, and as these forests that had once been widespread started to break apart, a portion of this Sahelanthropus chadensis group would have moved further west into the areas that were permanently forested. And those individuals went through their own evolutionary trajectory, own evolutionary history, and became what today we know as chimpanzees and bonobos. The other part of the Sahelanthropus chadensis group moved into the grasslands and started exploiting those savanna resources and adapting to those savanna resources. And over time, they became what we know as the hominins, eventually leading to us, the humans. So this might be the shared ancestor of chimps and humans. And I just want you to take note of the fact that this species wasn't discovered until 2002. So our understanding of hominin evolution has always been dependent on the data that we have at that moment. And you'll see as we go through each of these species that a lot of important discoveries have been made just in the past 20 years or so. And so in the early days of hominin evolution, a lot of the interpretations, it wasn't necessarily that they were wrong, but they were based on just the evidence that people had to work with at the time. And this also can help us remember that, where we are right now in 2015, our understanding of hominin evolution might change significantly over the next 15 or 20 years based on what we find in this, the coming time. Okay, so here we have Sahelanthropus chadensis down 7 million years ago in Africa. A nice, good starting point. Our next species is ORRORIN tugenensis. This dates to about 6 million years ago in East Africa. Looking at the legs of this species, they certainly are bipedal. They have femurs that indicate that they were well adapted to upright walking, regular upright walking. However, their arm bones still suggest that they were spending a lot of time in trees. And so this is probably an important trend in the first 2 million years or so of hominin evolution, that we were walking around probably during the day and then spending our nights in trees to stay safe from predators. Now you can see the fossils here. This represents most of what we know about ORRORIN tugenensis. So it's not a very well-known species, and as we find more, perhaps our understanding of this group will change. But for the moment, this seems like something that's definitely on our trajectory. So when we add this fossil into our timeline, we can see it here at 6 million years ago. We're not quite sure of the relationship between Sahelanthropus chadensis and ORRORIN tugenensis, but it's possible that we're looking at an ancestor and descendant relationship there. Our next groups are Ardipithecus KADABA and Ardipithecus RAMIDUS, which I'm combining here. These are both East African species, and together they span the time of about 5.8 million years ago to 4.4 million years ago. We think that KADABA is probably the ancestor of Ardipithecus RAMIDUS. But again, look at the number of fossils here. Although this particular skeleton, which has been nicknamed Ardi, is actually pretty complete for a skeleton this old, our understanding of this species is of course limited by the amount of data that we have. So this species, or this group, was first identified around 1994, but then other important finds have come out since then, and hopefully with further work in the area we'll learn more and more about this period in the middle. Looking at their limb bones, these are probably bipedal groups, although still retaining those elements of arboreal living, so living in trees. When we add these guys in, just drop them right in the timeline. Again, these relationships are not entirely certain, and we may discover that ORRORIN tugenensis is something entirely different, and it's not even on our evolutionary line. But for now, this is what we have to work with. Alright, so now we're moving into a new group of hominins, and a very important group of hominins. And these are the Australopithecines. So our first Australopithecine is Australopithecus anamensis. And this species dates to around 4 million years ago. You can see in this fossil here, it still looks pretty apey. It's still got nice big canine teeth, which is very typical of African apes. Relatively small brain, an East African species. They had large molars, so large grinding teeth, large canines, thick enamel on our teeth, or on their teeth, which tells us that they would have been grinding up food throughout a lot of the day. This species was discovered in 1965, so this was a nice, sort of on the earlier end of the discovery of all of these different species, but a very important data point in our understanding of hominin evolution. We think that this guy is probably the ancestor to the many different Australopithecine groups that come after. It definitely looks bipedal, and when we add it in, it's dropped in right here around 4 million years ago. So this is another species. It was only discovered in 1999, but Kenyanthropus PLATYOPS occupies a somewhat interesting place in our lineage. It doesn't appear to be a direct ancestor of humans, of our species, but it is something that evolved in East Africa, perhaps as a little evolutionary side shoot. They had relatively flat faces, which is what the word platyops means. Their molars weren't very big. It seems like they lived in these sort of mosaic environments, so perhaps moving back and forth between the savanna and then more wooded areas. It's possible that they may have contributed something to the technological evolution of our lineage. There are stone tools that have just been announced, the ones from 3.4 million years ago, that somewhat overlap with this time period. So it's possible that Kenyanthropus may have contributed there, but it's also possible that they were just sort of on the sidelines watching everyone else make tools and they weren't doing anything themselves. They might be an ancestor of these Australopithecine groups, but again, we don't have quite enough data to sort these things out. So let's move now to another group that was living around the same time. Not quite Australopithecines, not Kenyanthropus, but these are called the Paranthropusines. So this species, Paranthropus aethiopicus, a nice gorgeous skull that's referred to as the black skull because of its color. Paranthropus aethiopicus dates to about 2.7 to 2.3 million years ago. It's an East African species. They had nice, big, large teeth, this nice sagittal crest, which you can see here, sort of a bony mohawk that would have provided a place for chewing muscles to attach on the top of the skull. So when we see these big, flared-out cheekbones here and a nice, big sagittal crest, that tells us that these species spent a lot of time and invested a lot of energy in chewing their food. So probably they were very specialized in eating certain types of tough foods. Still a small face or a small brain on this guy, still a lot of ape-like characteristics. The species was first identified in 1967, or these bones were first found in 1967, and then further distinguishing them as Paranthropus was really something that came in the 1980s. Very robust species, and certainly if you compare this to Australopithecus anamensis, that earlier Australopithecine, you can see there are some really big physical differences between the two groups, including this much flatter dish-shaped face, the sagittal crest, the flared out cheekbones. These look like probably two separate groups of hominins. Our next group is another Paranthropus species, Paranthropus boisei, also from East Africa, living from about 2.6 to 1.2 million years ago. Again, you can see here the big, big cheekbones, the sagittal crest, definitely a hyper-robust species, a very stocky species, particularly in its face. Very large molars for chewing tough foods, sagittal crest. Then we move on to the Paranthropus robustus, and here we see a movement into South Africa. So robustus is from down here in southern Africa. If you look at their teeth here, compared to a modern human's teeth, you can see they had absolutely massive, massive back teeth. They lived from about 2 to 1 million years ago in South Africa. Again, part of this robust Australopithecine group. Nice sagittal crest, which you can just see a hint of here. Very big teeth. And a brain that's, not terribly large, only slightly larger than that of a chimpanzee. So with a lot of these Paranthropus species, we're still looking at something that seems pretty apey in a lot of ways, but still on our trajectory, on our general hominin, movement towards what we see today. So when we add in these groups, we left off our timeline with Australopithecus anamensis, adding in then our Kenyanthropus PLATYOPS. Not really sure what the relationship is here, so that's why we have a dashed line. And then Australopithecus anamensis, perhaps this led to the 3 robustus groups. But I'm putting these off to the side because they do seem to be their own little offshoot of the hominin lineage. And we will see with some other Australopithecine species that those probably belong in a separate category over here. So a lot of hominin evolution is, the emergence of these new species that may not ultimately go anywhere. They ultimately go extinct and they don't lead to us. But just because they went extinct doesn't mean they weren't successful. Remember, Paranthropus boisei here lived, this species was around for about 1 million years. We've only been here for 200,000 years. So that means that they were on the planet 5 times longer than we have been. We think of ourselves as being very successful, but we need to last another 800,000 years to be able to match the range of these guys. Our next Australopithecine is Australopithecus afarensis, and you probably recognize this little guy here, the baby Salam, and Dr. Alemseged, who spoke in the second homework video about the finding of this nice little baby girl who's about 3 years old. Australopithecus afarensis is also the species that gives us Lucy, who, when she was discovered in 1973, 1974, was the most complete hominin fossil that had been found at that point. So that was a very exciting discovery in hominin evolution studies. Australopithecus afarensis lived from about 3.8 to 3 million years ago in East Africa. Their canine teeth look very much like the canines that we see in other apes, like chimpanzees. They had nice big molars. Brains not very big, about the size of a chimpanzee brain, 430 cubic centimeters. But they were definitely upright walkers. We can tell that based on the angle of the femurs here. In fossils like Salam, the foramen magnum would also serve as an indicator of that upright walking stance. However, they did have long arms, which is still something that is a bit more primitive in our morphology, something that still looks very apey. So perhaps this species was still spending a lot of its time during the day walking around on the ground on two legs, but then spending a portion of their day in the trees, again, probably to be safe from predators. And if you consider the height of these individuals, between 3 and 5 feet tall, 5 feet, that's all right. We have a lot of humans on the planet today who are 5 feet tall, but 3 feet tall, that's a tiny little hominin, and definitely they would have needed to take any measures they could to protect themselves from the predators living in the East African savanna at that time. Australopithecus afarensis also gave us these fantastic Laetoli footprints, which we've talked about before. These sets of 3 footprints that stretch across volcanic ash that has been turned to stone. These footprints date to about 3.5 million years ago from here in East Africa. And an analysis of the depth of these footprints has yielded some really interesting information. So anthropologists had a human walk across basically wet sand, and then they measured the impressions of their feet as they were walking just as a normal human. Then they had the same human walk across the wet sand as if they were walking in this chimpanzee gait, the bent knee, bent hip gait, sort of the squat walking that's not very efficient. It feels like you're in a permanent squat when you're doing it. Definitely you get that burn going in your thighs after a while. Then they compared both of those impressions to the impressions from the Laetoli footprints. And they saw that based on where the impressions lie in the Laetoli footprints that you see here, they're much more similar to the impressions made by a human walking normally, which means that at 3.5 million years ago, these Australopithecus afarensis individuals were walking in a way that is almost identical to how we walk today. So they had not only become upright, but they had sort of perfected this style of walking that we now carry with us to the present day. Our next group is Australopithecus DEYIREMEDA, and this is a new group that was just discovered this year in Ethiopia. There's probably still a lot to learn about this group, but it was a very exciting new find because it's an Australopithecine species that lives around 3.5 million years ago, and it lives in the same general time period and the same place as the Australopithecus afarensis fossils, as Lucy. And so this means that there were multiple species of hominins, and some of them perhaps doing very similar things, existing in the same place at the same time. Our evolution is not just a linear progression from one species to another to another. There were many different offshoots, many different groups of hominins throughout time. Some were successful, some were not. These guys may have used stone tools. Again, those early stone tools that date to 3.4 million years ago line up with this general time period. So these are all recent discoveries, but they're really influencing the way that we understand our evolutionary history, and they're changing some of the things that we thought we knew for sure 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It's a very exciting time to be studying hominin evolution. Our next group is Australopithecus africanus, and this is actually the first Australopithecine species that was ever discovered. Discovered in South Africa in 1924. These guys lived from about 3 to 2 million years ago. We call them gracile Australopithecines because if you compare them to species like Paranthropus robustus or Paranthropus BOISEI or Paranthropus AETHIOPICUS, you can see they have very different morphology. These guys don't have that sagittal crest. There's a bit of flaring here in the cheekbones, but not to the extent that we see in the Paranthropus species. Their teeth were also a little bit smaller, so it looks like they were doing something different. They were doing something else than what the Paranthropus species were doing. They were investing their energy in different types of foods and not focusing on these strictly grassland foods. So they still have large molars, but their canines are getting smaller. They're sexually dimorphic from what we can tell, meaning that the males were larger and the females were smaller. But at that, they were still, 4 to 5 feet tall, small but getting bigger. There is evidence in this species that they were regularly some tasty snacks for predators in the area. The Tong child here was likely, if not killed, at least partially eaten by some sort of eagle based on scratch marks that have been found on its skull. It's also a very cool fossil because the back of its head is not really the back of its skull, but rather it is a cast or a mold of the inside of the skull. So after this little boy died around the age of 6, his skull filled up with sediment. That sediment filled in all the little nooks and crannies of his brain case, and eventually it turned into solid stone. Then the back of his skull broke off. So what we have left is a portion of his face that's preserved, and then a perfect cast of the inside of his brain case. It's sort of like having a fossil of his brain, which almost never happens in hominin evolution. It's very, very rare to find any sort of soft tissue preservation. But in this case, just because the skull was there to form this perfect mold, we now have this really exciting and unique fossil. The brains of these guys were still relatively small, 490 cubic centimeters, not much bigger than the brain of a chimpanzee. So up until 2 million years ago, we've still got a lot of small-brained but upright walking apey things living throughout East Africa and South Africa, and probably in the space in between as well. Our next Australopithecine species is Australopithecus GARHI, and this dates to 2.5 million years ago from East Africa. Again, you'll remember those other species, the other Australopithecus species like AFARENSIS, and the new one, DEYIREMEDA from Ethiopia 3.5 million years ago. We have a lot of overlap in species in this particular area, both geographically and in time. This particular species was found in the same layers, the same strata of earth as stone tools and animal bones that show clear signs of having been butchered, having been cut up. So that may suggest that this species was regularly eating meat or scavenging meat. So waiting until another animal, waiting until an animal died, or waiting until something like a lion killed another animal, and then going in and picking up the scraps of meat, cutting off the scraps from the ends of bones, perhaps breaking bones open to get at the nice marrow, the protein-rich marrow inside. This may have been an early tool user. However, being able to say for certain that any one of these species used stone tools is a little bit problematic because there are so many of them running around on the landscape at the same time. And we really won't be able to say for sure until we find a fossil hominin with a stone tool in his hand actively cutting up an animal, which, is never going to happen, unfortunately. So there's still a lot of mystery surrounding these guys, but the information that we have is presenting a much more complicated picture than we had imagined even 20 years ago or 30 years ago. This species, Australopithecus GARHI, might also be ancestral to our own genus, the genus Homo. So it holds an important place, potentially, in our evolutionary picture. Our next Australopithecine is Australopithecus SEDIBA, and this is another new species just discovered in 2010. This guy is about 2 million years old, from South Africa. There were a number of individuals found at the bottom of a cave together, so these might indicate some sort of family group. It appears that they ended up there sort of unintentionally, probably not buried there or placed there after death, but maybe they all made it into this cave and then somehow were killed. It's a little bit unclear. But based on their teeth and based on little tiny phytoliths, which are sort of like crystals that are in these little crystals called phytoliths are in plants, in fruit, in leaves as part of their basic structure. And these little crystals can sometimes get stuck in our teeth when we eat plants and when we eat fruits. So some of those little crystals stayed on the teeth of these individuals, and it suggests that Australopithecus sediba did routinely eat fruits and probably leaves. Fruits would come from a forest, so probably moving back and forth between forest and savanna. This might be somewhere in the lineage between Australopithecus and Homo. Not really sure about its placement, but we do need some more evidence there. So now when we add all of this to our timeline, you can see things are starting to get a little bit muddled here in the middle. So we had Australopithecus anamensis leading to DEYIREMEDA here in East Africa, but then perhaps also leading to AFARENSIS. Perhaps AFARENSIS gives rise to GARHI. Perhaps ANAMENSIS gives rise to AFRICANUS. Maybe SEDIBA is over here on its own. Not really sure what's going on here in the middle. And not to mention, we've still got these PARANTHROPUS species over here on the left. But you can see in this period of time between about 3.5 million years ago and 2 million years ago, we've got a ton of hominins running around East and South Africa. This must have been a very interesting time to be alive. So as we do more research, hopefully these relationships will become more clear. But in the meantime, we've got a lot of possible connections. As I said, Australopithecus GARHI may or may not be ancestral to Homo, but for our purposes, I've put it here as sort of the ancestor to the Homo lineage, which includes our species. So that's where we're heading next. And our first Homo hominin is Homo habilis, which is an East African species dating to about 2.3 million years ago. They had slightly larger brains than the rest of the Australopithecines, so 600, 700 cubic centimeters. We're getting toward the range of 1.5 to 2 times the size of a chimpanzee brain. The name Homo habilis basically means handyman, because at the time that this species was discovered in 1949, this was assumed to be the first tool maker. So these are some of the tools that were found in association with this particular species. And when you look at this skull, I mean, this looks a lot more human than some of those Australopithecine species. So it's very obvious why this was put into our genus Homo and not in the Australopithecine group. This was a tiny little species in the range of 3 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller, but tiny little upright tool-using ape man running around East Africa. Their postcrania still looks very ape-like in a lot of ways. But their teeth are smaller, and this is starting the trend that we see in tooth size for the Homo lineage, where teeth are getting smaller and smaller, probably because they were eating higher quality foods like meat. Again, thought to be the first stone tool users, and so these are Oldowan tools, although now we have even earlier stone tools referred to as Lomekwian. So again, every year something new is discovered, we have to sort of change our understanding of how this whole process worked. The next group is Homo naledi, and this was something that was actually just published within the last month. It's a new species from South Africa. We don't know how old it is yet, but a lot of people assume it's somewhere around 2 million years ago. Homo naledi presents a really interesting case in terms of how it was found and the context in which it was found. At least 15 individuals of this species were found at the back of a cave. And to get to the cave, a person would have to crawl through a space that was, like 7 inches tall? So very difficult to access. The people who discovered this species have suggested that maybe their placement in the back of the cave is part of some sort of burial behavior, or maybe even has religious significance. Although how you manage to carry a dead body through a 7-inch hole, I'm not entirely sure. But this is definitely an interesting find. It's caused a lot of controversy. Maybe it's a new species, Homo naledi. Maybe it's something that we've seen before. It might be another Homo species, and anthropologists have been debating this furiously for the last month since it was first announced. As we know more, as we get more data, hopefully this species will be a little bit more obvious in terms of where it goes in our timeline. Our next group is Homo rudolfensis, another East African species from just shy of 2 million years ago. They had pretty sizable brains, almost 800 cubic centimeters, which is about twice the size of a chimpanzee brain. They still had large chewing teeth, but we're not really sure what the relationship here is to other hominins. Is this something that is ancestral to us? Is it something that's just sort of an evolutionary offshoot? Time will tell. We need more data. All right, so if we drop in then to our timeline here, Australopithecus GARHI leading to Homo habilis, Homo habilis potentially leading to Homo naledi on one side and Homo rudolfensis on the other, or perhaps there's a succession here. Not really clear how these three groups fit together. But now we get to one of my favorite groups of hominins, Homo ergaster and Homo erectus. Now there are two names for this group, although many people consider them to be a single species. This group first emerged in East Africa around 1.8 million years ago, and seems in some places to have survived up until about 200,000 years ago. So a very successful group of hominins. They definitely first emerged in Africa, but they also expanded into other parts of the world, into Asia and into Europe. And this is what really makes Homo ergaster or Homo erectus quite cool. Everything else that we've looked at up until this point has taken place in Africa. And as you watched in the video, Dr. Alemseged said that 90% of our evolutionary history has taken place in Africa. So the fact that we see hominins existing in other places now with Homo ergaster and Homo erectus is quite important. This may be two species, it may be one. We can see that their teeth are a bit smaller. They made these fantastic stone tools, the Acheulean tools that are common with Homo habilis, but then also nicer Acheulean style tools, which require a lot more complex thought and probably also some level of language use or communication in order to teach other individuals of the group how to do this. We also see a big jump in brain size here at Homo ergaster at about 1,000 cubic centimeters. It's just a little shy of the brain size of humans that are alive today, and it's definitely a leap from where they had been. This big brain size probably is what enabled Homo ergaster to make these fantastic tools. More complicated tools allows individuals to access more types of foods more regularly, and probably meat, which would have also, in sort of a feedback, contributed to supporting these big brains. So we see big brains, we see cool new tools. This probably allowed Homo ergaster to expand into environments that its predecessors had not been able to. And in that process of expanding, they ended up expanding into the Middle East, into Europe, and into Asia. And we call this the Out of Africa 1 migration. It happened about 1.8 million years ago, which is right around the time that Homo ergaster first evolved. So it looks like as soon as these guys get their big brains, they start moving. This wasn't an intentional movement. It wasn't Homo erectus hanging out here in East Africa, and then finally one day they woke up and said, oh, we got to move. We got to get ourselves to Asia. We got to get into Europe. They had no idea that Asia and Europe were places. They just started slowly expanding from this East African center, and just little by little, if every generation you expand just a little bit, in the course of only a couple tens of thousands of years, you can make it from East Africa into East Asia. And without any, sort of jarring type of climate change. So individuals who lived here in East Africa It wasn't that they individually walked themselves all the way over to China, but just with every new generation, you just spread out a couple miles. Pretty soon, you can move a really, really long distance. So the out of Africa 1 migration of Homo erectus happens 1.8 million years ago, moving out of East Africa, through the Middle East, west into Europe, and then another group going east, making it into China, and some of them made it down here into Indonesia. The first evidence that we have for this migration outside of the African continent is from a site called Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia. So this is the former USSR. You see Dmanisi sitting right here. This is the earliest hominin site that we have outside of Africa. So it's very important because it tells us that this out of Africa 1 migration happened at least by 1.8 million years ago. At the site of Dmanisi, there's a whole range of tools, again, Oldowan tools, and then these more complex Acheulean tools. There's also a big variability in the types of fossils that are found at this site. Lots of skulls have been found, at least 6 individuals, like this guy here, and also this, we call him the old man, because you can see all of his teeth have fallen out. But this guy survived for a long time without his teeth. We can see that his jaw has actually sort of collapsed in on itself, which is what happens when someone loses their teeth, but they survive after that point. The fact that this old individual lost all of his teeth, but managed to survive for so long without them, might tell us something about how groups worked at this time. I mean, to me, this looks like he would have required some sort of care from others in the group. This shows, societal living. This shows contributing towards other members of the group. And that's something that's very, very human in a lot of ways. This guy wasn't just, pushed to the side as soon as he couldn't fend for himself, as soon as he couldn't get his own food. He was looked after. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that Homo ergaster and Homo erectus are so cool, because I think it's at this point in time where we start seeing hominins acting in ways that I think really typify our own species today. So a lot of those things that we think are very special about us as Homo sapiens, probably the root of those lie here at around 1.8 million years ago with Homo ergaster. All right, so we've got Homo ergaster now added into our timeline, ergaster/erectus. We know that they persisted, after they first emerged here in East Africa, they persisted in East Africa, but then they also spread out into Europe and into Asia. So this is the first time we're seeing a hominin spread into these other parts of the world. And in Asia, this group is often referred to as Homo erectus. So that's why I've labeled it erectus here. It's possible that over this sort of migration from East Africa into East Asia, there was significant change that we might want to call this by a different name. Okay, so now we're moving into some new geographic territory. Now that we have our Homo ergaster expanded into Europe and expanded into Asia. And so our next species is Homo heidelbergensis. This is a species that anthropologists have known about for a long time. It was discovered around 1907. We think that this species first originated around 1.2 million years ago and persisted until maybe 500,000 years ago. It's a European species. So this is one of the first true European groups. Sometimes they're referred to as archaic humans because they look very human in some pretty significant ways. They did have big teeth, but we can see that through this time period, their teeth were getting smaller over time. They made these lovely Acheulean tools, and they've been found from at least 2 really important sites. The first is Atapuerca in Spain, and a specific place called Cima de los Huesos, or the Pit of the Bones. And you can see an artist's reconstruction of the Pit of the Bones here. It's literally just a pit or a hole in the cave system that has a ton of Homo heidelbergensis fossils sitting at the bottom. Whether this was considered some sort of intentional burial is a bit uncertain. It may just be that when someone died in this group, you threw them down the hole and it was sort of like a trash pit. So there's lots of debris that's collected in the bottom here, but certainly an anthropologist's dream, right? To find a hole and all of these fossils just sitting there waiting to be discovered. The species gets its name from the place where it was first found in Heidelberg, Germany, another important Heidelbergensis site. Our next group is Homo antecessor, and this was also found at the Atapuerca complex in Spain from two important sites, Cima de Elefante and Grandolina. This species lived around 800,000 years ago, and there seems to be some evidence for cannibalism in this group, which you can see depicted in this artist's reconstruction on the right. Looking at the skulls of these individuals, there are certain places where there are cut marks that are very similar to the cut marks we see when humans butcher animals. The cut marks are lined up in some particular places, though, that suggest that the heads of members of this group were regularly, or at least semi-regularly, cut open to remove things like the tongue or to strip off big chewing muscles. And they're the types of cut marks that we would typically associate with the removal of flesh for eating. So this may have been a semi-cannibalistic group. Now, why were they cannibalistic? It's hard to say. We don't have an exact reason for it. We might speculate. We know that humans in the modern world or in historic times practice cannibalism for a couple of reasons. One might be as a show of strength or a show of victory over your enemies. I mean, if you vanquish someone in war and then you eat their face, it's a pretty symbolic way of saying, I'm in charge here, I have the most power. Or maybe it's a way of absorbing your enemy's strength. Some people also eat parts of their relatives' flesh after the person has died as a way of sort of commemorating that person's life and keeping them with them as they continue forward. And then, of course, cannibalism is sometimes practiced as a way of avoiding starvation. When it comes down to it and a group of people have absolutely no food at all, if someone in the group dies, that's a good holdover food. So there are a couple of reasons why this group might have practiced cannibalism, but we can't say for sure what any of it would have been. Now, this species was given a new name, antecessor, but it might actually be the same as Homo heidelbergensis. Again, we need more data on both of these species to be able to say for sure whether it's two groups or one. Our last European species is Homo neanderthalensis, and this is probably one of the most well-known hominin groups. These were some of the earliest hominin fossils ever discovered, with bones being found as early as 1829 or 1856, but it wasn't truly identified as a separate species until a little bit later. This group lived from about 200,000 years ago until 28,000 years ago, so they persisted really recently. They lived in Western Europe and also in Eurasia, into the Middle East here. It seems that many of the things that they did looked very similar to things that our early Homo sapiens ancestors did. They were very, very good hunters. They made beautiful stone tools, so they were very technologically adept, and particularly when it came to hunting. They didn't, however, seem to make items of art. They didn't seem to make personal ornaments. They didn't paint on cave walls. So there were some ways in which Neanderthals were still significantly different from our own species. But if we look at their skeletons, we can see they have much sort of stockier skeletons. They're more robust. And this is probably an adaptation to cold weather, because this part of the world, during the time when Neanderthals were living there, was basically an ice age. It would have been very cold, and so these are physical adaptations to help resist the cold. If you compare that to a Homo sapien today, we are much longer and leaner, which is better for a tropical environment. Neanderthals, as I mentioned earlier, had absolutely gigantic brains, bigger than that of humans today. Typically, we associate bigger brains with smarter brains, and that may or may not be a true scenario. These guys had bigger brains. Does that mean they were smarter than us? Well, I mean, they certainly were smart in a lot of ways. Smarter than us, it's hard to say. I mean, we're the ones who are still here, which may not mean that we're smarter than they were, but at least it means that we were able to better adapt in certain environments than they were. Okay, so now let's add in some of these European species. We've got Heidelbergensis here, we've got antecessor coming next, and then after that, Neanderthalensis. And we're going to launch into these other species on the right in just a moment. But you can see once ERGASTER and ERECTUS spread into Europe and Asia, they continue on their own trajectories. And if we come back to Africa, we do have ERGASTER persisting throughout this time period, but we sort of have a cessation on new species after 1 million years ago in Africa. And something important is going to come along here, but we just haven't quite gotten to it yet. Okay, so our next group is a relatively new group to have been discovered. We refer to them as the Denisovans, and they don't have an exact species name yet because we don't have enough information about them. But this is a group that we suspect lived from around 400,000 years ago to about 41,000 years ago. And the only evidence that we have for them comes from a cave in this part of Siberia called Denisova Cave. The only fossils that we have of this group are a tiny little chunk of finger bone and a tooth. That's not a whole lot. And certainly we wouldn't want to name a whole new species based just on a tooth and part of a pinky bone. However, this pinky bone still had viable DNA in it when it was found by anthropologists a few years ago. They sequenced this DNA, expecting that it would belong to a member of our species, Homo sapiens, or perhaps to a Neanderthal, but it turns out the DNA is distinct from either humans or Neanderthals. So this represents a new group of hominins, or at least a very different group of hominins than has been previously discovered. It's possible that they share a common ancestor with Neanderthals. So sometime in the past there was a group, perhaps Heidelbergensis, that then split into two. Half of them became antecessor and then Neanderthals, and the other half becoming this group, the Denisovans. But again, with such limited data, we're really limited in our interpretations. There have been some artifacts found in association with these finds, though, including things like bracelets, which is pretty cool because we don't see Neanderthals making jewelry. And if these guys made jewelry, that would complicate the picture even further. So now, adding in the Denisovans here, we see that in Europe and Eurasia around the same time, we've got Neanderthals and Denisovans living in, sharing the same continent. Neanderthals in the west and Denisovans in the east. One of our last groups of hominins to talk about is Homo floresiensis, which is a very exciting new find. This species was just discovered in the last 10 years or so. It's a little tiny dwarf species that has been found in the island of Flores in Indonesia. So this is Southeast Asia. These guys probably are remnants of a Homo erectus group. So as Homo erectus was spreading out across East Asia and into Indonesia as a part of the Out of Africa 1 migration, some of those Homo erectus probably made it to this island of Flores and then became stuck there. They became isolated. And so that means that for hundreds of thousands of years, they didn't have a very large gene pool to work with. They couldn't share their genes with the other Homo erectus that were living in other parts of Indonesia and in other parts of mainland Asia. So one thing that tends to happen when you get species isolated onto islands like this is that big species become small and small species become big. That's exactly what happened here. So if you look at this diagram, here's a picture of a modern adult human today, and then this is the reconstruction of one of these Homo floresiensis fossils. So they were teeny, teeny, tiny little creatures. Sometimes they're referred to as the hobbit people because they were so small. There were also elephants that were first on the island at the time of the Homo erectus that over time became teeny tiny as well. So we see these two big species becoming small. But then small things like rats that lived on the island over that same period of time, those became big. So this island biogeography is quite cool in how it has the potential to change species over periods of time. Homo floresiensis was definitely a tool user, but their tools remained pretty primitive and similar to the artifacts that Homo erectus was first using when it arrived in East Asia. This species also persisted until only 18,000 years ago, which is super cool. We always think that our species, once we got here, we ran the show. But this little guy was hanging out in Indonesia up until 18,000 years ago, which is very, very recently when we consider the whole span of hominin evolution. A very exciting find, and definitely sort of, it doesn't necessarily complicate the picture of hominin evolution, but it makes it more interesting because it shows us that there may be these little pockets of hominins, all over Africa, Europe, or Asia. So we add in Homo floresiensis here in Asia as a descendant of Homo erectus, with Homo erectus continuing on its own in mainland Asia. So our timeline has now filled up in Africa, it's moved into Europe and Asia, and now we're going to jump back to another very important group here in Africa, and that is Homo sapiens, us. We first evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago, and we've persisted to the present day up until that time. Now, we started in Africa, but obviously we've spread out into Europe, into Asia, into Australia, and then eventually into North America and South America. At the time that we first emerged in East Africa, we were extremely variable, just like we are today. Today, if you look around the world, you see that culturally we do things very differently from place to place. And physically, we have a lot of physical variation from place to place. We're still similar enough, though, that we are a single species. But this variability is something that we see even at the very beginning of our lineage. The earliest fossils of our species are found in Ethiopia. The earliest from a site called Omo Kibish that dates to 195,000 years ago. The next oldest are from another site in Ethiopia called Herto that date to 160,000 years ago. These skulls seem to show some evidence for a mortuary practice, or a ritual that occurs after death. It appears that these skulls, after the time of death, the person's flesh was removed from their face. And then there are some places on the skull where it's almost as if a polish has been developed. And this is interpreted as being a polish from the skulls being placed in some sort of leather bag. So if you've ever, had a leather bag, you know that sometimes if a part of that bag rubs against some other surface for an extended period of time. If you're a female, you might know a leather handbag rubbing against your hip. There will be a small part on your handbag that rubs a little bit smoother and a different color than every other part of the handbag. It's kind of the same thing that we see on the backs of these skulls, which indicates that these skulls had rubbed against something for continuous periods of time. That's interpreted as being some sort of leather bag. And so basically the thought is that after someone died in the group, humans would have then removed all of the flesh from their face and then put their skulls in a bag to carry around from place to place. Now, whether this is to keep your family close to you, or maybe this is sort of, showing off the skulls of the people that you vanquished, we don't quite know. But it does suggest that people were doing something with their dead after they had passed on. Alright, so now we have our Homo sapiens here emerging in East Africa 200,000 years ago, and obviously persisting to the present. Our story doesn't quite end there yet, and there are a couple more important steps to get to the point where we have humans everywhere as we see them today. So first, we've got to talk about these two sites of School and Kafsa. Now we have our ancestors emerging here in Africa 200,000 years ago. And they lived very happily in Africa and East Africa, and probably spreading out to the rest of the continent, for about 100,000 years. But then, 100,000 years ago, some members of our species started to migrate outside of the African continent, and made it at least as far as Israel. Okay, so moving up through here, following a warmer climate, following animals that they like to hunt, they made it into Israel. Once getting to Israel, and surviving there for a little while, it looks like the climate started to change again, and it started to become cool. A little bit too cool for members of our species. And so those first members of our species who made it to the caves that we now call School and Kafsa in Israel, they went extinct. The first time members of our species tried to expand outside of the African continent, they went extinct. They couldn't hack it. It was just too cold, and they were used to warm weather. So members of our group go extinct in Israel, and then we actually see the Neanderthals, who were still living up here in Europe, because it was suddenly cold in Israel, they come back down, and repopulate Israel. What we see going on between Africa and Europe, as an African species, we were very good at doing warm weather. Neanderthals were very good at doing cold weather. And so the Middle East, this place in the middle, we sort of rotate who gets occupation of the Middle East based on whether it's cold or whether it's hot. But I think the important point here is that when we first tried to expand, we failed. We failed horribly. So, we are a species that requires certain things for our persistence. And we may be so specialized at certain times that things don't work out very well for us. But then, some time later, around 70,000 years ago, maybe up until 50,000 years ago, our species finally gets it together. We finally get to the point where we are able to successfully migrate outside of the African continent. And so, again, from the same place in East Africa, we see some members of our species moving up into the Middle East, and then eventually hooking a left into Europe and hooking a right into Asia, and then down further south. You will note this looks exactly like the migration route that Homo erectus took 1.8 million years ago in the Out of Africa 1 migration. Not surprisingly, we refer to this migration of Homo sapiens as Out of Africa 2. Okay, same route, East Africa into Europe, and then into China, Indonesia, and Australia eventually. During this migration, not only did we fill in places where members of our species had never been before, but we also ended up running into other groups of hominins that were already there. So we see Homo sapiens moving around 50,000 years ago into Europe and into Asia. In Europe, members of our species arrived there around 50,000 years ago. These were the individuals who are sometimes called cavemen. Another name for them is Cro-Magnons. These are the guys who made all of these nice pieces of jewelry. They painted on cave walls. But at the time that they walked into Europe 50,000 years ago, there was another group of hominins already living there, the Neanderthals. So suddenly, members of our species had to adapt very, very quickly to the fact that they were in a new environment and there was someone else already occupying that space. They did this they adapted by either competing or interbreeding with Neanderthals, and it's actually a combination of both. So in one sense, we competed with them, in that we competed for resources, and members of our species were ultimately very successful in getting more resources than the Neanderthals. So Neanderthals, once humans come into Europe, Neanderthals start going extinct, and they start moving further and further to the west. Some of them, though, did interbreed with members of our group. So we know that there was some mixing of genes between Neanderthals and humans, although ultimately Neanderthals lose this particular battle, and they become extinct by 28,000 years ago. The last of them that we have evidence for is over here in Portugal. So after we push them all the way west, then they just cease to exist. This mixing of genes is very important. And what we're seeing more and more is that mixing of genes is something that really typifies human populations. So members of our species that confronted Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe, we definitely mixed our genes with them. And anyone who has Eurasian ancestry today probably has some component of Neanderthal DNA in there. Even though the Neanderthals went extinct, we still have some of their DNA in our own DNA sequences. And the same thing seems to have happened with the Denisovans. This Siberian group that we only have the pinky bone and the tooth from, we also interbred with them. And so there are also humans today that have a little bit of Denisovan genetic material in their genomes. So wherever we met these people on our expansion outside of Africa, we mixed our genes, which have been preserved into the modern day. Now, we haven't yet found evidence for another fossil hominin living at the same time as us in Africa. But some interesting work from the last couple of years has suggested that there are some African populations that show some sort of genetic mixing with a mystery group here in Western Africa. So it looks like both in Europe and Asia and Africa, every time a human ancestor encountered another group of hominins, we mixed our genes with them ever so slightly. So we now have Homo sapiens in Europe with a little bit of Neanderthal DNA added to the mix, Homo sapiens in Eurasia with a little bit of Denisovan DNA in the mix, and then Homo sapiens in Africa with this mystery group adding their genes into the mix as well. And this gets us to Homo sapiens throughout the old world. And in every place we end up, we've got a little bit of this extra DNA to, I don't know, give us a little extra flavor.